The broadcast is now starting. All attendees are in listen-only mode.
Hello everybody and welcome to the second webinar as part of this Agile webinar series. And today's webinar is with Fran O'Hara of Inspire Quality Services here in Ireland. And he is going to be presenting lessons learned integrating tests into the Agile Lifecycle. And Fran is no stranger to webinars here at EuroSTAR. He's done many of them. We're delighted he's joined us again. And if you have any questions for Fran about this webinar, if you want to join the webinar discussion that is created over on Test Huddle, you can do so here at this link. I've just shared a link with you all now, and you'll see it in your chat box. So directly after the webinar, that's where we're going to be heading, and we will look at the questions you have, just see your feedback, and just hear what you have to say. So now I'm going to hand you over to Fran. Hello, Fran.
Thanks, Dara.
Now Fran's just going to open up his slides here, and then we'll get started. Okay, we can see
so you
your
see my
screen
slide,
there.
Dara?
We can indeed.
Okay, perfect. Okay, welcome everyone. Thanks very much for joining. Just a little bit about me first. I have about 30 years experience in the software industry. I've worked as a developer, as a tester. Then I got into project management, line management, and eventually then into kind of consulting in the whole quality test, agile area. And I've been doing that latter thing since about the mid-90s, late 90s. It's been mainly agile for about the last 8 years or so. So what my company does, Inspire Quality Services, is basically support organizations in transitioning to Agile. We do coaching, training, that type of thing. For example, we prepare people for the professional Scrum Master, professional Scrum Product Owner certifications from scrum.org. We do ISTQB, all that kind of stuff basically. So this presentation is about kind of sharing my experiences, helping organizations integrate test with this focus area from a test point of view. Apologies if I have a bit of a cough at the moment, so hopefully I'll get through with that.
Hi, Fran. Sorry to jump in there. Just we missed maybe about 10 seconds there of your introduction. Just got a little cut off. If you wanted to just run back over that real quickly.
Okay. Briefly, as I was saying, that we support organizations transitioning to Agile and provide coaching and training in areas like Scrum and professional qualification there from scrum.org at ISTQB. I also co-founded a testing services company in the early 2000s called Insight Test Services that was later acquired by Sogeti. So I kind of span these two areas, testing on one hand and Agile on the other, and of course the integration and linkage of the two, which is the focus of this talk basically. Okay, so let me get into it then. Quick introduction slide then. I'm going to talk a little bit just about Scrum, just so we're all on the same page. The last time I looked at the version 1 survey, I think there was about 70% of organizations that were doing Agile were using Scrum or some hybrid version of Scrum. And if you look at scrum.org, the website from Jeff Sutherland and Ken Schreiber, basically you'll find the Scrum Guide, which is a 16-page definitive definition of Scrum. I think it's a very useful, succinct description. And it covers all these items here. The owner who owns the product backlog and basically does the long-term planning and manages the requirements and sets the priorities. Scrum Master looks after the process, and the development team who do the work and implement the requirements effectively. The events like planning at the start of sprint, the daily scrums, the daily stand-ups every day that the team do, the development team do. And then at the end you've got the review where the team show what they've done to the product owner, and then the retrospective where you look at improving your process. In the background as well, there's some look-ahead work where you refine the backlog and get the backlog ready for future sprints in terms of its stories and acceptance criteria and so on. And then there's the artifacts like the product backlog, as I mentioned, which is the main source of requirements, the sprint backlog, which is basically the plan for that sprint that the team do, burn down chart showing what's left to do during the sprint, and then the definition of done, which is the agreement about what we have to do to be creating potentially reusable software in terms of testing and so on. So you know, we need to consider though that Scrum is insufficient though. We need to draw from technical engineering agile practices such as those described in XP. For example, two key ones would be continuous integration, and associated with that is automated testing, maybe using test-driven development at the various levels. And also in the real world, many organizations do, they're not able to release every sprint, so they have to do a bit of longer-term planning, do some release planning, which often takes a number of sprints before there's enough scope to release. And we also have scale issues and so on. But this is it in essence anyway. So that's the intro. Getting then into the whole test side of things and integrating test and lessons learned. I think one of the key lessons I've seen is and observed with agile teams is the tendency to throw the baby out with the bathwater. Basically, if you look at the Agile Manifesto, you've got the values, the things on the left over the things on the right. You've got individuals and interactions over process and tools, working software over comprehensive documentation, and so on. Now the statement says, while we value the items on the right, we value the items on the left more. So I think what often happens is that teams go completely to the left-hand side and maybe throw out good practices that they had before or don't adapt them appropriately for an incremental life cycle. As an example of that, consider QA, where we're trying to build quality in as we go and prevent defects, or at least detect them very early, rather than trying to test quality in at the end. Like in Agile, we're not going to have your traditional QA function where we have rigidly defined processes, independent QA departments auditing projects against those processes, lots of metrics and criteria and so on. That has no place in an Agile organization. However, we do want to build quality in and prevent defects. So we've got to look at how we achieve that in an Agile context. So, for example, we can prevent defects in requirements by clarifying them through effective backlog refinement. Having lots of informal discussions between the product owner and the team, Q&A, doing quality risk analysis in our backlog refinement sessions, in sprint planning sessions, informally along the way, so we can prevent defects in requirements and focus on a preventative aspect as an Agile team. We can do things like using coding standards and maybe static analyzers to help enforce them. We can do code reviews, refactoring. We can use acceptance level TDD or behavior-driven development to create early test definition, which helps add to the spec and the clarity of what's required, and again helping to prevent defects. We bring more transparency through a shared definition of done, and so on. So these are all, I guess, ways in which we can apply effectively building in of quality and preventing defects in an Agile context. So another example of throwing the baby out with the bathwater would be, the second value in the manifesto talks about we value working software over comprehensive documentation. Now, Agile doesn't mean no documentation, it means appropriate level of documentation where they're effective and they're useful. And in general, documentation is used to record conversations. And if we bear that in mind, we may eliminate a document or reduce, let's say, the level of detail we need to record because of the fact that we have good interaction and conversations and so on. But what I often see as a lesson learned is that when organizations say we don't need a document, they stop doing the associated activity. An example of that would be test planning. You typically don't see IEEE 829 master test plans in an Agile team. And many teams, as a result of that, don't do test planning, particularly at a release level, at a cross-sprint level, and that creates lots of problems. I'm going to talk a little bit more about that later on. So in terms then of the value that's put on quality and testing in Agile organizations and teams, I've found a great deal of variety there, basically, related to the perceived value of quality and testing. Some teams really struggle from this point of view. Testing isn't valued. Maybe it's because of a lack of knowledge. Sometimes it's a management issue, lack of support and guidance, and there's a number of other reasons. I'll touch on some of them during the webinar. Whereas other teams can focus very strongly on building sufficient quality in and testing and not letting technical debt become unmanageable, so that they help maintain their productivity and velocity over time, and as a result minimize their total cost of ownership of software, rather than having it undermined by lots of high maintenance because of lots of technical debt. I would say that in Agile there certainly is an opportunity to assess quality as you go with incremental development and all the feedback loops that you have in this empirical process control system. Basically, there's a better balance between verification and validation in Agile, because at the end of the sprint we can validate that we've built the right thing. However, you don't automatically get better quality in Agile. It isn't automatically going to result in better value put on testing and quality. So, we need to look at that and work at that. And in terms of professional testers, do we value them in Agile? Again, I've seen huge variety there. My experience, Agile teams that do have a strong test competency outperform those who don't. And professional testers help bring this test competency to the team. Now, these testers may not be your independent objective testers in the traditional sense, but their testing mindset will help develop strong test cases based on requirements and stories and based on conversations, and they can feed off the product owner more. I think Bob may have talked about this yesterday in his webinar, in terms of deriving their tests based on what's required. They can augment that, of course, through conversations with developers, but they ensure that they focus on requirements rather than what a developer has already implemented as such. Which leads us on, I guess, to the idea of the developer. What is a developer? And one of the lessons I've seen is the danger of terminology. Scrum is about having cross-functional teams. Okay, and the word developer, you've got the product owner and you've got the Scrum Master, and then the development team is made up of developers. It's a very specific title for everybody in the development team. And a developer, therefore, could be a programmer, could be a designer, could be a database specialist, could be a tester. So, it is a little bit confusing, but the whole reason behind it is to ensure we don't have sub-teams. We just have a single cross-functional team. It's about whole team thinking, and it's made up of a mixture of competencies. So we just call everybody a developer, rather than having these silos of functional areas that you have in your traditional organizations. However, this can be misinterpreted. There's terminology. I've actually seen it happen in organizations whereby they say, oh, Scrum says you've got developers, so we don't need testers. So they fire their testers, and they lose that test competency. What happens? Quality suffers. And they end up trying to recruit testers again and augment that loss of competency that resulted. So that's a big lesson, I think. Just beware of the terminology there in Scrum in particular, around the use of the word developer. In terms then of the tester in the Agile team, again, you find a purist view out there that says, all testers have to be able to program, all programmers have to be able to test, everybody, in other words, has to be able to do everything. I take a more pragmatic view, and I think it may be a view shared by Janet Gregory and people like that, in that, T-shaped people are a better way to look at it. So you don't want somebody to be a specialist and able to do nothing else, because that doesn't help the overall team in situations where a particular specialism isn't available. At the same time, people have personalities that lend themselves to being good at certain things, and there's a certain personality type that's good at testing. They're pedantic, they have attention to detail, they question, and so on. So you don't want people who are, able to do everything, because in a sense they'll be a jack of all trades, so they'll be mediocre at everything and a master of none. I think ideally what you want is this idea of T-shaped people. They have a specialization, they have mastered an area like test, but they can also turn their hand to other areas as well. And if you look at the tester, for example, their competency is testing. They find bugs, they write good tests, they question, they clarify, they prevent defects. And in terms then of their broadening out their skills, again, they can get into the requirements analysis side. They can support the product owner in backlog development, refinement. They make great reviewers. you know, of those requirements with that testing mindset. They're asking questions because right now that story may not be measurable and testable. Testers have to think in very concrete terms. If I give it an input, what's the expected result? You know, the development side, on the technical side, they can develop automation skills to automate their testing. They can also help developers with their testing and so on. So, you know, if you look at integrating testers into Agile teams, I think this is a useful way to look at it, that they bring that competency, and but that they over time they broaden out. You know, so the lesson I think here is to you know, we need to ensure sufficient test competency in the Agile team, where quality is going to suffer, technical debt is going to increase, and productivity therefore is going to reduce over time. But also, just because we have a tester doesn't mean we have the required competency in the team, and we've addressed that competency. Like, that might be a junior tester. And what about areas like you know, test approach and high-level risk analysis and so on? They may not have that experience and competency. So again, you've got to be pragmatic and decide if you've got a resource in short supply, maybe that resource, it's ideally everybody's full-time, but if that resource is scarce, it may need to be shared between teams. I'll talk about that. So if we look at the role of test managers and traditional test management, again, you know, what can happen in an Agile organization with a transformation is that we throw the baby out with the bathwater, that we, you know, get rid of that line function, or we amalgamate it into a single Agile line manager who maybe doesn't have a strong test competency. We still need an oversight on our overall test competency in the organization. Of course, we have to hire and fire people and manage performance and so on. But I think in terms of, let's say, practices and the process and strategies, I think the line management, whoever is responsible for that, whether you have retained your original test management function, they look after the competency of testing, or whether you've amalgamated that into some Agile line function, they have a balancing act, basically, to perform. On one hand, you don't want them to be too directive in terms of processes and tooling, as you want teams to feel empowered. And if they're being told exactly what to do and when to do it, they're not going to feel empowered, therefore they're not going to take on that accountability and ownership, they're not going to be creative and so on. So you don't want too much dictatorship coming from a line function in an Agile organization. Again, what often happens, though, in terms of throwing the baby out, is basically that the line function gives no support, you know, and teams do need support and guidance, in particular areas like continuous integration, test tooling. You know, you need centralized support for that. If you don't, you'll have a lot of teams struggle with continuous integration. You'll have a proliferation of testing tools across your organization and minimal learning and synergy across teams as a result of that. But I think one of the key areas, I think, where you know, line test function can help is being proactive in coming up with appropriate Agile testing strategies, going in with their eyes open rather than going in with their eyes closed and the associated problems that can result. So I think, you know, from a test point of view, we need to be proactive. We need to develop Agile test strategies that are going to support and guide the team, but without being prescriptive, so that the teams feel empowered. So it's a tricky area, you know. First of all, who's going to do it in an Agile organization, and secondly, this balancing act that needs to be struck. You know, the other type of test manager, of course, is your project test manager. And again, you're not going to typically have that in an Agile team and across every Agile team. You will, of course, have some teams that have some very experienced people that have experience around test leading and so on. And of course, the job that they do is around test approach and planning, traditionally. And if you don't have that particular resource, that particular competency in the team, you're going to have a problem in terms of that Agile team coming up with an appropriate test approach based even on an organizational test strategy. Now, the way I've seen this addressed is you can try and address it indirectly or bottom up through, you know, communities of practice and sharing of experience and eventually those teams helping each other from that point of view, from a test perspective. Or I think what may be more effective that I've seen is you know, a more direct addressing of the issue through appointing, you know, individuals who can act as test champions or test consultants and maybe can be shared between teams. They're not managing, they're not dictating, they're just advising. and maybe making up for a lack of test competency in areas like test approach and so on, if that isn't available within the team. Again, it's just a practical issue. The ideal is every team has every competence that they need to produce potentially releasable software. But I find in the real world that that's sometimes a problem to get that. And this is a way, I guess, to address that deficiency. Of course, if you have somebody in that role, they may also be able to help with test coordination issues across multiple Agile teams, where we have to look at the overall strategy for testing a product produced by multiple Agile teams developing features. Again, at scale, these kind of areas need to be looked at a bit more. In terms of integrating professional testers then into the Agile team to support whole team software development, I like this slide. It basically shows this collaboration that takes place, the magic that takes place in an Agile team where everybody's helping everybody else out towards a common goal. And again, there's no delineation, demarcation lines around areas like test. Everybody's doing what they can to produce done software. So, you know, here the different color codes are showing what the product owner does on their own, the tester does on their own, what the programmer does on their own, but also what they do together. So obviously the tester is a key role that can, if you have a professional tester in an Agile team, they can work very closely with the customer, with the product owner, basically to create story level type tests. I'll talk about Mark's testing quadrants briefly later. That refers to Q2 type tests that are in that space. So basically creating tests against requirements, business focused tests. And again, that's often just done as a set of tests against the acceptance criteria of a story. But a tester would expand those tests. They want to break the software. They want to locate defects. So they look at boundaries, they look at exceptions, things like that. So they will expand those as well. The developer will be thinking about how to code, and they'll collaborate with the tester maybe to automate those requirements-based tests. And those tests, of course, play a specification role, as we talked about later. The developer may do unit-level TDD. They may pair up with the tester, and then the tester may do some exploratory testing, and then finally some customer UAT type testing. I think that's one lesson I think I'd pick, apart from just the need for this kind of collaboration and integration of testing across the roles and the roles collaboration to achieve that effective testing. One other thing I'd like to highlight as a lesson learned is exploratory. And the value of it to complement test automation. You know, automation is checking, you get a binary result, whereas exploratory is more of a human investigating something. And I think this is sometimes underutilized in Agile teams. Sometimes automation becomes the goal almost, and we're almost looking for 100% automation. And you should never be looking for that. You always need something like exploratory testing. And I think session-based is a way to go there, because and it can be quite adaptive, of course, which is what you need to be.
Hi, Fran. Hi, Fran. Yeah, sorry for cutting you off again, jumping in there. We lost you there for about 30 seconds. If you might want to go back over that slide in case people miss anything. You're kind of just dropping a small bit, so we don't want to miss out on any content.
Thanks a lot. Thanks a lot. What I was saying here was really the need for collaboration, you know, across the roles, and showing, you know, this slide just kind of shows maybe what individuals might to really integrate testing through the various roles and to work together.
I'm sorry to do it again to you, Fran. The same thing happened just there again. I don't know what it is on that slide. Maybe we'll try just one last time going over there, and if not, we can come back to it. But you seem to disappear for about 10-15 seconds there.
Okay. Really what I was talking about here was the integration of testing across the roles, and how the roles would collaborate in whole team software development, as described by Lisa Crisp and Janet Gregory. It's worthwhile having a look at what they say about it. But the other thing I wanted to point out here in terms of a lesson was the lesson around exploratory. I find that a lot of Agile teams do insufficient exploratory testing, not enough. Their focus is on automation. And there's always a role for exploratory. I think it's a very powerful approach to blend and complement automation. I think particularly session-based, it can be used in a more strategic way. Yeah. Okay, looking at the lessons learned from a Scrum point of view and the integration of test into the Scrum ceremonies or events, this kind of shows a sprint or a series of sprints. I've only shown 2 sprints here. Sorry, this is in a sprint. This is a 2-week sprint in this particular example. So it starts off with sprint planning and everybody attends. It finishes with a sprint review and a retrospective where everybody attends. And every day then you have your daily stand-up, and as needed you have backlog refinement. Now the timings on this are the rules in the Scrum Guide based on a 1-month sprint, even though I've only shown a 2-week sprint here. So typically for shorter sprints these durations would be shorter. Anyway, the things I want to point out here, the lessons learned, if I take, I'm going to take 3 of these events. One of them is backlog refinement. And I think one of the key things here is to have input from that test competency within the team to help review and refine those requirements in a preventative way like I talked about. That is your opportunity to prevent defects through the questioning, through the refinement, through the improvement of the acceptance criteria and so on. The other element of backlog refinement is estimation. And again, the lesson learned there is to ensure that there's appropriate test representation in those estimates. And I think one of the best ways I've seen that done is using story point estimation with planning poker. So planning poker is the wide band Delphi technique effectively, and it's to try to get a true team-based estimate with the various perspectives represented, and in this case including and integrating the test perspective. And through an iterative process you come up with a true team-based estimate that reflects the various work that has to be done, and therefore the estimates associated with the pieces of requirements that you've got. A lesson from a sprint planning point of view, from a quality and test perspective. I think one of the most common lessons and problems I see is that Agile teams implement a push system rather than a pull system. Scrum is supposed to be a pull system. It's the development team that decide what they can take into the sprint. It's not a product owner or Scrum Master decision. Now the first part of sprint planning is identifying what to do. The second part is identifying how to do it. So in that first part we're trying to come up with a goal for the sprint and the associated product backlog items that we can take in to achieve that goal and that we have the capacity to do and meet the associated definition of done. And I think one of the problems is not having it as a pull system, and that therefore creates too much scope being put into the time frame. So you end up cutting the corners, you end up squeezing testing, you end up with quality issues, you end up with technical debt. So I think it's a very fundamental point that needs to be taken on board when you implement Scrum. Like Kanban implements a pull system by explicitly limiting work in progress. Scrum does it implicitly through a pull system in the sprint planning session. And I think that's an important area to think about from the point of view of quality and test. The other kind of lesson I see with sprint planning is that it's supposed to be joint design. So the team are jointly designing a solution to the requirements. But some of the areas there that I see problems with is maybe not designing with test in mind, like design for test, not maybe focusing on a quality risk assessment in that discussion, and maybe test-related tasks being missed in terms of helping to achieve the definition of done at the story or sprint level. Finally then, retrospectives, sometimes the point there is there's insufficient focus on testing and insufficient focus on improving the definition of done, which really is a key artifact, the definition of done, to help manage your technical debt so it doesn't become unmanageable, to help ensure that you've got good enough quality. So there are a few lessons in relation to Scrum events and ceremonies from a quality and test perspective. So from the point of view of integrating test into the life cycle, I think these comments from James Whittaker are good guidance. Basically, we need to blend quality and testing together, put them into the blender so one is indistinguishable from the other. So I think that's a good thought to have in mind in terms of this whole topic, rather than seeing them as distinct phases and separate to each other, done by different people and so on. So these are the scenarios that you might come across. I used to come across scenario A quite a bit, but these days it's more of a rare occurrence, thankfully. where you've got testing working as sprint behind the actual design and coding. This means, if you have scenario A, it means you've got a very weak definition of done coming out of a sprint. It hasn't even been tested. And that's going to create problems then in sprint 2 when the guys are going on to develop new code. They're being brought back to fix the bugs found in the code from sprint 1 and so on. Apart from the fact that you've moved away from the Scrum rules of having potentially releasable software coming out of sprints. You're a long way away from that because you haven't even tested it properly yet. So scenario B is much more common. It's mini waterfall, okay, so that most of the test execution is happening at the end of a sprint. And there's a number of reasons why this occurs. What you want, though, is scenario C, where you've got full, complete, early integration of testing within the sprints. So how do you achieve this? There are a few prerequisites, I think. First, you've got to start with testing when in a sprint. So if I look at this sprint backlog here, I've got 4 columns. I've got the product backlog items down the left, which are typically your stories and their acceptance criteria. There's only 4 shown here, but typically there'll be more than that. Each of them is in a swim lane, and then there are 3 columns associated with the tasks to implement that story. There's here I think it says open, development, done, but often you see to do, in progress, and done as your 3 columns. So this is showing a snapshot of progress during the sprint. So some of the tasks are in progress, some of them are done, some of them haven't started yet. The big arrow here is showing that we should be, well, I'll come back to that, sorry, I'll come back to that. Looking at the prerequisites, the first thing we should do is do test-driven at the acceptance level. Now ideally we're automating test-driven in that way at the acceptance level or using VDD, but even if we're not, if we're just doing manual testing, we should be defining our tests as the first thing we do. The first task I think that should come on the do list for a product backlog item should be define the test tasks, because they will help prevent defects. They will help clarify the requirements. The developer, the programmer, the designer will understand what tests have to pass when they start to implement that story. And of course, in terms of integrating tests through the lifecycle, it means testing is happening right at the start of a sprint rather than coming along halfway through. The other thing that is a prerequisite to allow us to fully integrate testing into the lifecycle of a sprint within sprints is small stories. If we have a large story, it's not going to become available for test execution until the end of the sprint. So by definition, we're going to get many waterfalls, or worse still, the stories will span sprints. So here's a guide, a rough guide of what a story size should be, like a half to 6 days person days effort. Again, if you're using story points and Fibonacci sequence, ideally this would equate to 1 to 13, this type of range. Now we don't want to make it that correlation explicit, because what we're trying to do with planning poker and on story points is to separate estimation from commitment, and there's a danger if we talk about days we'll be getting into commitment and fudging and so on. Anyway, that's a side issue. So small stories will allow us to be completing stories within a few days. So we're executing tests within a few days. So we define them right at the start. We're executing tests against small stories. Obviously, as a developer, it does unit level TDD and integration and so on, and then we do story level tests within a few days. But also, of course, we're only working on 2 or 3 stories at a time maybe. We're not working on all 10 or 15 stories in parallel, because if we did that, they'd all become available for test execution at the end. So I think these 3 prerequisites help ensure that we fully integrate testing within the sprint. Okay. One other point on this, I sometimes see an extra column in the sprint backlog. The team board, as it's sometimes called verified or verification. I don't think this is a good idea, because what it's doing is it's reinforcing the separation between maybe testing and the other activities. Testing is just one of the tasks, and the various tasks within testing are just tasks that go on the board, just like every other task. We want it fully blended. We don't want to separate things out. So I think it's better just to have your 3 columns to do, in progress, and done. So in terms of stories and making them small, here's a little example. Let's say as a user I want to cancel a reservation, so I avoid being charged full rate. Now in backlog refinement, and I guess we potentially revisit this in the first half of sprint planning, but I'm a big believer that backlog refinement should do most of the work here. to clarify and refine the stories. And really we should be the first part of sprint planning, where we define what we're going to do and clarify that, should be the smaller part of sprint planning. We should spend more time on how we're going to do it. So anyway, here's a story. As usual, I want to cancel a reservation so I avoid being charged full rate. Now, I think the sequence that the slide came up in here was the story description, a conversation with lots of questions, and then the confirmation or acceptance criteria that came out of that. I don't particularly think that's the right sequence. I think the product owner should be coming to the table with a decent set, ideally, either them or their delegates, with a decent set, put a decent set of requirements together in terms of stories and their acceptance criteria, rather than coming to the table with some high-level epics with no acceptance criteria. So they need to do a fair bit of legwork, otherwise backlog refinement sessions aren't going to be efficient. Now the conversation, all the Q&A, will help refine the story in terms of its description, in terms of the confirmation criteria, so that they're clear. So the confirmation criteria or acceptance criteria define the boundaries of the story, what's in scope, what's out of scope. They augment and clarify the requirement. And therefore, you know, refining that through Q&A, raising things that haven't been addressed, are they in scope, are they out of scope, getting that clarification I think is really important to prevent defects. In terms of making stories small then, there's lots of patterns and ways to decompose them if we think it's too big. So we either intuitively know it's too big, or through our estimation we realize this is a, 40 story points worth. You know what I mean? It's an epic. It's not a story. Whatever. So one of the simplest ways to decompose a story is to hive off some of the acceptance criteria into a separate story. So for example, on the right-hand side there, the last item under conversation talked about what about if the user has already paid the deposit and you want to cancel? We just make that into another story. Similarly, the bottom two bullets there on confirmation could be separate stories. Similarly, we could split the story along users. For example, we've got premium users and we've got non-premium users. We could separate them out. So there's lots of ways and patterns to decompose stories, because the thing we need to remember is that a story is an increment of development, told from a user perspective, but it's an increment of development, okay? Thin sliver of functionality. Ideally, that covers the various layers in your architecture. Ideally, we start with these functional, non-functional stories. It's not a minimal marketable feature. It's not a minimal viable product. It's not something that we would probably consider releasing on its own. It is told from a user perspective, but it's an incremental development. And a whole collection of these are required to collaborate to provide an overall feature that a user would actually use as a cohesive feature or set of requirements. So that's the first thing I guess we need to remember. That will help us keep them small because we can take that perspective. Okay, release and feature level planning. I mentioned the idea that we typically don't have project test managers anymore in Agile teams, but the test competency around test planning and strategy I think can be problematic in Agile teams. I touched on that earlier. These points are adapted from the ISTQB, the new Agile tester extension, to the foundation level. And it mentions how testers or test team can add value in release planning and replanning in these various ways. Focusing on the middle one there, planning the testing for the release or feature level. That is to create a test strategy or approach, again, depending on whether you have an organizational one or not. If you don't, you'll have to create from scratch. If there is an organizational one, you can adapt it to create your own specific test approach for your release. So things like resources, tools, test levels, what static testing are you going to do? Are we going to use static analyzers? What kind of reviews are we going to do? Environments we're going to need, automation, techniques, all of that type of stuff as a function of the scope that's going to be released and that's been planned for this release and the risks involved. Now obviously this has got to be adaptive, okay? The product backlog will evolve and so on. And therefore we'll create a big detailed IEEE master test plan, but we are going to do planning. If we want to record some of that, then happy days. We can take a digital photograph of a whiteboard, whatever we need to have a small document, whatever's appropriate. But the activity, I guess, is the key thing. And one of the main lessons from the point of view of integrating tests is that this often gets missed. And we end up being too story focused. We don't think about the big picture. This is sometimes reinforced by a narrow definition of acceptance testing in Agile. Traditional definition of acceptance testing, if you look at ISTQB, it talks about user acceptance testing in IT environments. It talks about alpha-beta testing for product development. It talks about a couple of other variations like contract or regulation acceptance testing and ops acceptance testing. In Agile, though, acceptance testing has a different meaning. This comes from Agile Alliance in terms of the definition. And what I often see is that acceptance testing ends up being equated to story-level testing. Okay, and there's a lot of confusion around what exactly acceptance testing means. It doesn't actually matter what your definition is, as long as that definition is understood by your teams, and as long as any additional testing that's required to address your quality risks are being performed as part of your overall test strategy or approach. So the lesson learned here is that many teams equate acceptance testing to story testing and think that that's sufficient. Do some unit level component integration and do some acceptance and we're done. And they miss out on other types of testing, other types of risks. We may need to expand to fuller system level tests of the functionality, the non-functional requirements, testing those like performance, usability and so on, looking at story interaction, testing at a feature level, an epic level, workflows, end-to-end scenarios, system integration. Again, it's only if these areas are a risk that you need to do this type of testing. But we need to consider and plan for what approach we need depending on risk, and we need to keep revisiting that as we move from sprint to sprint. So this is pretty much test strategy that I'm talking about here, and identifying based on risk and your context what kind of testing you need to do. And Marek's testing quadrants that I'll show shortly, is a good thinking tool for trying to determine what kind of testing we need to do. Because if we just focus on stories, we end up just testing a bunch of leaves, and we've lost the big picture. We've lost what the tree looked like. So a product backlog, can be the way we structure the product backlog can be very useful to help us drive testing at different levels. We can have themes for releases. We can have epics supported by features. We can have functional stories, constraint stories with acceptance criteria. And instead of just thinking of testing at the story level, we can test at the feature level, at the epic level. We can organize maybe by workflow. We can have a sequence of stories that relate to a workflow and test that workflow. So we need to think whether our product backlog is actually structured like this, or whether we need to do this kind of analysis from a test perspective. Either way, the lesson learned is that it often gets missed. This big picture thinking gets missed, and we get blinkered by stories and just test at the granular story level, and therefore we don't address certain risks. So again, Marek's testing quadrants, useful way to think about the kind of testing you need to do as a starting point for developing a test strategy or approach. He breaks it up into technology facing, business facing, breaks it up into supporting the team, for example, through automation, through clarifying requirements in a test-driven approach at story level. On the other side, evaluating product, mixture of automated, manual, tool support. And it's really all about though. What are the quality product risks that you've got, and therefore what kind of testing do you need to do? So that will be different. You've got to do that assessment of risk in your context for your systems, for your product. And I'd refer you to Lisa Crisp and Janet Gregory's book on Agile testing for, a description and elaboration and so on of all of this. But I think the key point is the lesson learned here is to come up with an approach that is suitable for the risk that you've got to address. And I think this is a key role of line management, Agile line management, to be proactive here in terms of trying to provide guidance for what is a good strategy, and then teams can adapt that as appropriate. But if you look at these testing quadrants, again, I think the lesson is it only talks really about the type of testing you're going to need. It doesn't really look at the application of this to an incremental life cycle. So just a couple of points on this before I finish up. Here's showing a series of sprints. We may have, obviously we need an initial product backlog, which at least has enough to feed the first sprint in terms of stories. But that backlog may be much bigger because we might want to have an initial view of what scope might be in the release. We'll do late elaboration and so on. We'll embrace change, but we do have some initial concept of a release plan, and we do some release planning, and incorporated within that, in parallel with that, we need to be thinking about test planning, because the test approach or strategy will impact on the scope that we can release based on the definition of done. Anyway, when we get into the sprints, we typically do the testing that's always talked about in Agile, trying to integrate the way we talked about in terms of unit level, component integration level, story acceptance level, story interaction, doing exploratory, and so on. And I think the point is the lower level stuff sometimes gets missed or gets pushed till the end. Thinking about the higher levels, feature level, system integration, thinking about non-functional like performance usability. So we need to consider those. You know, one of the key values of Agile is to focus on working software. Scrum is very strong on creating potentially releasable increments out of each sprint, which means that if the product owner decided to release it, it's ready to release. It's done based on a strong definition of done. So the bottom points here, the bottom diagram here is just really showing. Yeah, it reminded me a little bit when I thought about this about a RUP. As you move from iterations in RUP, some of the activities are done more and more. So some of the higher level activities, some of the non-functional test activities are done more and more. As the system evolves and expands, we need more to think about. We have something concrete, we have a larger scope upon which we can do some usability testing, upon which we can do some performance. Now obviously we can do performance at a unit level, we can profile the execution of key bits of code that will contribute to overall system level performance, we can look at database queries and make sure they're efficient, we can benchmark performance and make sure it's not degrading across sprints. The lesson learned is that a lot of teams don't do that. They park all this stuff till the end because it's a bit harder. They do stabilization sprints, hardening sprints at the end. And the lesson learned is that that stores up a lot of risk, okay? And you can end up having lots of problems as a result late in your release cycle. And it's also not agile. You know, to be more agile, you want to be more potentially releasable with a stronger definition of done coming out of your releases. So finally, that definition of done, it is agreement between the product owner and the team. It guides you. It's a source of tasks in sprint planning, increases predictability. It can be shared by multiple teams on the same product, that type of thing. You could even mandate a minimum standard definition of done across teams that teams can then augment. Here's just a little example showing you some teams would use 3 levels of done. Done for a story, done for a sprint, anything additional you'd need to do before you're finished with the increment coming out of that sprint. So for example, you do more regression, you do exploratory across those stories, you do some performance aspects based on that scope of functional stories you developed, and so on. And then at the release level, maybe there are certain types of tests that are, at least initially, are hard to do within sprints, large-scale integration. So some of the lessons learned, you know, and ideally over time you improve this. You know, you move things that are at the release level back to the, you integrate them better into the life cycle, into the sprint level, so you're producing more potentially useful software. So some of the lessons learned around definition of done are it's weak, it's vague, it's maybe not as detailed as this that I'm showing you here as an example, or it's just not followed under pressure. You know, there's maybe too much of a push system rather than a pull system, or it doesn't improve over time. There's some of the lessons I see there. So summary then, conclusion, some of the key points is focus on prevention, early detection, not just late detection. Put development and testing into that blender and avoid the mini waterfalls. Think about the activity and the value of the be proactive and helping to develop a useful guideline test strategy that will help guide the team and achieve that balance between not being too prescriptive but not being too unsupportive. Yeah. Okay, so that's pretty much it. Thanks very much for listening. Hopefully you've
Thank you very much, Fran, for that presentation. Sorry for interrupting you here and there as well. I think the audio issue was more on my end than it was for anybody else, so I hope I didn't distract you too much. Thank you to the attendees as well for attending today's webinar, and I'm just going to open up my screen here again. I have 1 or 2 slides to go through. The first slide I have here, I just want to mention, is our final webinar as part of this Agile series, and this will take place tomorrow at 2 p.m. This is with Jan-Jaap Kannegetter, and he will be presenting Improve Your Flexibility by Mastering Different Ways of Testing. I also want to make you aware that the program for the EuroSTAR Conference 2015 will be announced on Thursday the 9th of April. So make sure you stay tuned to the EuroSTAR Conference's website for information on that. And finally, let me just share a link with you again that will bring you through to Test Huddle discussion, where you can ask Fran various questions. You can see what other attendees had to say about the webinar and just give him feedback. And you'll see that link there now in your chat box. Thank you again, Fran, for today's webinar. The webinar is now over, and we shall see you all over on Test Huddle.